Rob here at etrailer.com, and today you're going to be taking a look at the SumoSprings rear helper springs on our 2019 Newmar Canyon Star Motorhome. Now here at etrailer.com we get a lot of questions about motorhomes, specifically about the suspension. Because if you've ever driven one before, you can realize how soft and kind of mushy they feel when we're driving down the road. Especially if a big gust of wind comes, there's a lot of area for that wind to catch, and it just ends up pushing us around. When we turn, we end up fighting the steering wheel, and then even when we do go to turn, we get a lot of that body roll where the motorhome will want to lean before it actually gets into the turn. So for us driving, it can be a little stressful, not to mention all the people in the back that have to deal with that as well. Our SumoSprings are going to alleviate a lot of those problems, making it more comfortable for us to drive, feel more in control, and the passengers can enjoy the ride as well. So now that we have our SumoSprings in place, let's take it on a test course and see how they handle. As I'm going through my course here, I can definitely feel a lot more stable as I'm driving. And as I come up to the slalom course here, and I start going in and out of the turns, it definitely feels a lot more rigid, and I don't have so much of a rolling feeling going on. It just turns when I tell it to turn, rather than before when it starts to turn, lean really bad, and kind of just feel unstable. But it feels a lot more in control and a lot easier to drive. And as I'm going over the speed bumps, it's definitely improved. It still has a bump to it, but it's not as jarring and it's not as hard, and it reacts a lot quicker. It's not continuing to bounce as I'm going down the road. And when I get to the alternating speed bumps, I still have a little bit of a roll, but it's a lot more improved over the factory because, again, it's reacting a lot quicker, and I can actually go over the speed bumps and not have to worry about fighting the steering wheel to get it back centered. So here's what our helper springs look like once we have them installed. You can see that they're going to bolt directly to the frame and then sit right on top of our factory leaf springs. So it's going to give us a lot more cushion and stability when we're going down the road. Our springs are going to be progressive, which means that the more weight and the harder we push down on them, the stiffer and more compressed they're going to be. But when we have a lighter load or there's not that much downward pressure on it, it's going to have a soft engagement and it's going to absorb a lot more of the shock. Now we're going to have one spring on each side of our motorhome, so if we make a turn, one spring is going to compress while the other one is going to elongate. That's going to help out making sure that our motorhome stays nice and level, and we have a lot more control and we don't have so much of that rolly, kind of soft feeling when we're driving, or when we make a turn it feels like our motorhome wants to lean real hard before it turns. This is going to help reduce that and make it feel like we're a lot more in control. Now you might be wondering, how is this spring going to be able to stretch up if this one is compressing and the other side is stretching? Well, our springs can actually stretch out over 50%, so we're not going to lose any kind of suspension travel. And when they do compress, we're not going to have to worry about any nearby components because they're going to have very minimal lateral expansion, which means they're not going to spread out to the side when they start to compress. The spring itself, the yellow part in the middle here, is going to be made out of a high-density microcellular urethane, so it is going to withstand most automotive chemicals, road salts, and UV rays. And they're going to work in temperatures all the way from -25 degrees, so if we're up in the mountains, it gets really cold, they'll work great. But also if we're down in the desert, it gets extremely hot, these are going to work all the way up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Our springs are going to be rated at 5,400 pounds, but keep in mind that these are not going to increase the capacity of your motorhome. They're just there to help support that extra weight, give us a nice comfortable ride so we can feel more in control. Now it's going to come with all the brackets and hardware necessary, and we are going to have to drill through the frame in order to get a few bolts in place. Now that we've seen the end result and gone over some of the features of our springs, let's put one side on together. To start out, we're going to need to assemble our spring before we can put it in place. So we want to make sure we grab both the lower, upper bracket, our spring, and 3 of the flange bolts out of our kit. So if we grab our spring, we'll notice that we're going to have 4 holes on one side. That's going to be the top. And 2 of these holes are going to line up with the 2 holes in our upper bracket here. We're going to place it on top of our spring until we can get the 2 holes to line up going down through. And grab one of the flange bolts. We're just going to loosely secure it for now, making sure everything's lined up and they thread in there easily. And you're going to make sure that that tab here is facing up, and the wings on the back that have the holes are going to be flat against the spring going towards the back. Once the bolts are loosely in place, we can come back with a 9/16 socket and snug those up. We're going to take our bracket and we're going to flip it over. And we're going to have a single hole on the bottom of the spring. Now that's going to line up with the single hole that's in our lower bracket. Now you want to make sure that the tab section is sticking away from the spring. We'll line up our holes and very loosely get this started. Except we're not going to fully tighten this one up. We just want to get it started where it's going to be a little snug where we don't have to worry about the bracket coming off. But you still want a lot of movement in that bracket so we can make any kind of adjustments when we need to. Now that the spring is ready, we want to get our motorhome ready. So we want to make sure we park it on a flat level ground. And we're going to use our leveling jacks to lift up the back end just enough so that the tires can come off the ground and then we can remove them. That way we have enough suspension sag that we have a little bit more room to work with, but you want to make sure you're being safe, so make sure to put jack stands underneath and everything is supported. So we can grab our spring assembly now, and on the lower bracket where that large opening is, that's going to be going towards the front, and on the back side there's going to be a hook, and that's always going to be facing towards the back. So we're just going to place our spring directly over the front of the axle right on top of the leaf spring. Now this hook here, we want to hook around the front U-bolt on our leaf spring pack, so we'll just bring it back. Make sure it hooks in place, and then the lower bracket here is also straddling the leaf springs. Now that the spring's loosely in place, we're going to take a few measurements. I'm going to grab a tape measure. We're going to measure from the very top of the frame, and we're going to come down a total of 6 inches. We'll make a mark. We'll do that on the other side next to our bracket as well. Now the marks we made, those are going to line up with the bottom holes, but obviously we're going to need to lift the spring up or get it in position to where they are going to line up, because right now the suspension's hanging down and it's not in its normal state. So I'm going to use a floor jack to raise it up so we can get all of that lined up. If you put a floor jack right underneath the hub of the axle, that way it'll lift the one side up. I just do suggest doing this one side at a time. That way the tires are still on the other side. That way we have a little bit of leverage when we're lifting it up. It'll contact the ground and we don't have to fight the axle. And then once you have it lifted up, you want to make sure that each side is nice and level, because as I was lifting it up, it actually got stuck, and one side was above, one side was below. So you just want to make sure again that it's nice and square and that the holes are lining up on each side. Now that we have everything lined up, I'm going to come back with that paint marker. I'm going to mark my lower hole on both sides, and then I'm going to come up, I'm going to mark that middle hole as well. We'll mark all the holes, and we're going to need to drill these out. Now we have the option of leaving our spring in place and using it as a template, but I've found after doing a lot of these, it's just easier to mark your holes, take everything out, and then drill them out, because then we're not going to have to fight the bracket or making sure nothing moved on us. If we just mark it, pull it out, and we can drill those out. I'm going to start out by drilling a somewhat small hole with a pilot bit before we come back and enlarge it to the final size. So let's go through and drill our pilot hole for all 4 locations. Once you have your pilot holes drilled, I'm going to come back with a drill bit. You can use a 3/8, or if you want to go a little bit bigger, it'll make it easier for the bolts to go through. We got a little bit of wiggle room if it's not exactly right. So just a little bit bigger than a 3/8, and we'll drill these out to the final size. With our holes drilled, we can loosely put our assembly back in place and raise it back up so everything lines up. Then we're going to take the long black flange bolts. We'll go through our bracket, through the frame, going all the way to the other side. And do that for all 4 locations on our spring. Then on the inside of the frame, we'll attach a 3/8 flange nut to each one of these bolts. Now, most likely it'd be easier just to kind of crawl underneath and put the nuts on, but if you have enough room to where you can reach behind it, You can get them in place. We just want them to be on there hand tight for now so we can get the rest of the hardware in. Now on the lower bracket, we're going to have a square hole on either side of the leaf spring. So we want to grab a carriage bolt out of our kit. We're going to drop it down. Now it may be a tight fit since the spring is going to be right there, but we should be able to sneak it past it. Just put a little bit of force. It should sneak right past it. If you need to, you can just grab something and give it a tap until it drops all the way down through. We're going to put a bolt on the inside as well. Now we're going to grab the clamp that goes underneath. You'll notice it's going to be kind of a C or a U shape. You want the flat section to be right up against the leaf springs. It's going to have 2 holes, so we'll line those holes up with our carriage bolts. Bring our bracket up, and then we're going to secure it down again with those 3/8 flange nuts. And just get these loosely started so that bracket doesn't fall off. Then we'll come back and tighten everything up. I want to grab a 9/16 socket, and I'm going to snug up my 2 nuts holding the carriage bolts in place. When you tighten these up though, you kind of want to alternate going back and forth so it'll evenly draw up that bar. Now I'm going to grab a 9/16 wrench, socket, or whatever you can fit in between the leaf spring and the lower bracket here, and we're going to tighten up that bolt holding the lower spring in place. And finally I'm going to come back with a 9/16 wrench and socket, and I'm going to tighten up the bolts and flange nuts, securing everything to the frame. And with this side in place, we can put our wheel and tire back on, and we repeat the same process on the other side. That'll finish up your look at the SumoSprings rear helper springs on our 2019 Newmar Canyon Star Motorhome.